An unexpected Christmas guest. An original story, produced by Cafe Tales. The snow fell thick and heavy on the little suburban neighborhood of Oakwood, blanketing the streets and roofs in pristine white. Christmas lights blinked cheerfully from every house, and the sound of carolers echoed faintly in the cold night air. It was a few days before Christmas, and while most people were cozied up by their fires, Doris Cooper sat alone in her immaculate living room, nursing a cup of cocoa. The mantel was lined with garlands, and the tree sparkled with silver tinsel and delicate glass ornaments. Everything was perfect, just as Doris liked it, but perfection couldn't chase away the gnawing loneliness that had crept in since her husband's passing 3 years earlier. Doris sighed and glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was barely 8 p.m., but the night already felt endless. She toyed with the edge of her knitted throw, her mind wandering to Christmases past. Gerald had loved Christmas. He always went overboard with the decorations, the gifts, the elaborate dinners. The house had been alive then, filled with laughter and music. Now, it was silent, too silent. She got up and wandered to the kitchen, opening a tin of cookies she'd baked earlier. They were perfectly formed, sprinkled with sugar, but the thought of eating them alone made her lose her appetite. Doris placed the tin back on the counter and stared out the window at the swirling snow. A knock at the door startled her. She froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. Who could be visiting on a night like this? She set down her cocoa and smoothed her skirt before making her way to the front hall. Peeking through the frosted glass, she saw a man standing on the porch, his shoulders dusted with snow. Who on earth could that be? She muttered to herself before opening the door. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said, flashing a polite smile. He was tall and handsome, with neatly combed dark hair and a wool coat buttoned up to his chin. "I hate to trouble you a few days before Christmas, but my car decided to give up the ghost just up the road. Would it be too much to ask for a phone to call a tow truck?" Doris hesitated. It wasn't every day that a stranger appeared on her doorstep, but he looked so harmless and it was almost Christmas. "After all, of course," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in, out of the cold. You must be frozen." "Thank you," he said, brushing snow from his coat as he entered. "It's bitter out there tonight." Doris led him to the telephone in the hallway, but as he picked up the receiver, he frowned. "No dial tone," he said, giving the receiver a few futile taps. "The storm must have taken the lines down." "Oh dear," Doris said, wringing her hands. "You're welcome to stay here until the weather clears up. I wouldn't feel right sending you back out in this." Ban hesitated, then nodded. "That's awfully kind of you, Mrs. Cooper," she said. "Doris Cooper." "Richard," he said, extending a hand. "Just Richard. And I'm very grateful, Mrs. Cooper." Doris busied herself in the kitchen, putting on a fresh pot of coffee. She wasn't sure why she felt so nervous. Perhaps it was the suddenness of the visit, or the way Richard carried himself with an air of confidence that felt slightly out of place. But it had been so long since she'd had company, real company, that she decided to set her apprehension aside. "Would you like some coffee, Richard?" she called from the kitchen. "That sounds lovely," he replied, his voice warm and smooth. "You have a beautiful home. By the way, thank you," Doris said as she carried the coffee pot and 2 mugs to the living room. "I try to keep it nice." As she poured the coffee, Richard looked around, his eyes lingering on the garlands and the carefully wrapped gifts under the tree. "Spending the holiday season alone, Mrs. Cooper?" he asked, taking the cup she offered. Doris nodded, settling into her armchair. "Yes, it's been that way since my husband passed. Gerald loved Christmas. He made it special. You know, it doesn't feel the same anymore." "I can imagine," Richard said, his gaze thoughtful. "But you've done a fine job keeping the spirit alive. He'd be proud, I think." Doris felt a flicker of warmth at his words, though they also brought an ache to her chest. She sipped her coffee in silence, watching as Richard leaned back on the sofa, his expression unreadable. "Do you often get visitors during this lovely season?" he asked suddenly. She shook her head. "No, you're the first in years. Most people have their own families to be with." "Lucky me, then," Richard said with a faint smile. "I suppose fate has a way of bringing people together at just the right time." For a moment, Doris thought she saw something in his eyes, a glint of something she couldn't quite place. But before she could dwell on it, Richard raised his cup in a silent toast, and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Doris watched Richard over the rim of her coffee cup as he settled deeper into the sofa. There was something unplaceable about him, a presence that both reassured and unsettled her. He exuded the kind of confidence that wasn't brash but seemed to come from knowing he belonged wherever he chose to be. Yet, in the flickering firelight, she caught shadows in his expression, a brief tightening around his mouth, a distant gleam in his eyes that hinted at something else. "So, Richard," Doris began, hoping to steady her thoughts. "Are you passing through Oakwood, or visiting someone?" He smiled faintly, his fingers cradling the coffee mug. "Just passing through, really. It's the kind of town you'd miss if you blinked. Quiet, pretty. You've lived here long." "My whole adult life," Doris replied. "Gerald and I moved in right after we got married. He loved the small town charm, said it was the perfect place to start fresh." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Start fresh? That's an interesting way to put it." Doris hesitated, realizing she'd said more than she intended. "You know how it is when you're young and building a life together. Everything feels like a new beginning." "Of course," Richard said easily, "though sometimes starting fresh means leaving things behind. I imagine Gerald was quite the man to make such a bold move." She gave a small, tight smile. "He was." Richard shifted slightly, setting his mug on the coffee table. "I couldn't help but notice the photograph on the mantel. That's Gerald, I presume." Doris's eyes darted to the framed picture. It showed a slightly younger version of herself, and Gerald, arms entwined, standing in front of a sparkling lake. He was grinning broadly, his hair tousled by the wind. It had been taken the summer before his death. "Yes," she said softly, "that was our favorite spot. He loved the water." Richard's gaze lingered on the photo. "The lake, peaceful place, isn't it?" Her stomach tightened. "It is. Do you know it?" He glanced at her, his expression inscrutable. "Only by reputation. They say it's lovely in the summer, a good place to escape the noise of the world." Doris nodded, feeling the conversation tugging her toward uneasy memories. She reached for the plate of cookies and offered it to him. "Would you like one? They're fresh." "Thank you," Richard said, taking one and examining it briefly before taking a bite. "Delicious. Did you bake these yourself?" "I did," she said, relieved by the shift in topic. "Baking helps pass the time. It's quiet around here, especially during the holidays." "Quiet can be a blessing," Richard remarked, "though I imagine it gets lonely too." Doris's grip on her cup tightened. "I manage." "You seem strong," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Not everyone could keep a home like this all on their own. It's impressive." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or something else, but she chose to take it at face value. "Thank you." For a while, they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Richard's presence seemed to fill the room, commanding attention even when he said nothing. Doris found herself glancing at him more often than she intended, drawn to the way he seemed so at ease in a house that wasn't his. "Do you believe in fate, Mrs. Cooper?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. She blinked, startled by the question. "Fate? Yes," he said, his gaze steady. "The idea that certain things are meant to happen, no matter what we do to avoid them." Doris hesitated. "I don't know. I suppose I've never thought much about it." Richard smiled faintly. "It's a curious thing. Sometimes, life takes us to places we never planned to go, puts people in our path we never expected to meet. Like tonight, for instance." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just that you've been very kind to a stranger on a snowy night. Most people wouldn't have opened their door." Doris's lips parted, but no words came. She felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. "Kindness is rare these days," Richard continued, "and trust even rarer. But sometimes, it's trust that brings us the most unexpected outcomes." She swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed under his gaze. "Would you like more coffee?" she asked, rising from her chair. "That would be wonderful," Richard said, leaning back once more. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper." In the kitchen, Doris steadied herself, against the counter, her mind racing. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about Richard's presence unsettled her. He was charming, polite, and yet there was an undercurrent she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath and filled the coffee pot, willing herself to push the unease aside. When she returned to the living room, Richard was standing by the mantel, studying the photograph of Gerald more closely. His back was to her, and she paused in the doorway, watching him. "You must miss him," Richard said, without turning round. Doris's heart skipped a beat. "Every day," she said softly. He turned then, his expression unreadable. "Grief. is a heavy thing to carry. But some burdens are lighter when shared, don't you think? She nodded, unsure of what to say. As he took the coffee from her hands, their fingers brushed, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of knowing, as if he understood far more than he was letting on. Fire had burned low in the hearth, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. Doris adjusted the blanket on her lap, her hands folded neatly over it, as Richard returned to his seat on the sofa. His presence still unsettled her, though she couldn't quite articulate why. There was an ease about him, a subtle charm, but beneath it, something more, something probing, as though he were peeling back layers she'd long kept hidden. Richard sipped his coffee, setting the mug down with a quiet clink. "Tell me about Gerald," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "What kind of man was he?" Doris hesitated. Talking about Gerald always felt like navigating a minefield of emotions. "He was a good man," she began carefully. "Hard-working, reliable. He had a way of lighting up a room, especially during Christmas. It was his favorite time of year." Richard's gaze was steady, encouraging her to continue. "You must have shared many wonderful memories together." She smiled faintly, the edges of the expression tinged with sadness. "We did. He loved decorating the house, finding the perfect tree." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, staring into the embers. "He made everything feel magical." "It must have been difficult," Richard said softly, losing him so suddenly. Doris stiffened. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. "Yes," she said finally, her tone clipped. "I'm sorry if I've touched a nerve," Richard said, though his eyes betrayed no regret. "It's just that sometimes sharing memories can help keep them alive." Doris forced a smile. "You're very kind, Richard, but some memories are best left where they are." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to grow colder, the fire's warmth unable to dispel the creeping chill of their silence. Richard leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "Did Gerald spend much time at the lake?" he asked suddenly. The question hit her like a jolt. "The lake," she repeated, her voice thin. "Yes," Richard said, his tone casual. "It must have been a beautiful place for someone who loved the outdoors." Doris's hands tightened around the blanket. "He enjoyed fishing there," she said cautiously, "but that was years ago." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine it holds a lot of memories for you both. Peaceful evenings, quiet mornings, moments that linger." She felt her chest tighten. "It does," she said shortly. "But like I said, those memories are in the past." Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're right, of course. The past is the past. But sometimes it has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it." Doris looked up sharply. There was something in his tone, an undercurrent of meaning she couldn't ignore. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she reached for her cocoa, taking a long sip as she tried to steady herself. Later, as the clock struck 11, Doris excused herself to retrieve another log for the fire. She needed a moment away from Richard, a chance to collect her thoughts. In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. How did he know about the lake? She had been careful. No one had seen her that day. Number one could have known what had happened. It was an accident, she whispered to herself, the words trembling on her lips. It was an accident. The sound of Richard's voice from the living room startled her. He was humming softly a tune she couldn't quite place. She forced herself to take the log and return to the fire, determined not to let him see her unease. When she entered the room, Richard was standing by the mantel again, examining the photographs. His back was to her, and for a fleeting moment, she considered telling him to leave, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the creeping sense that doing so might provoke him further. "Your home is so orderly," Richard said without turning round. "Not a thing out of place. It's admirable." "I tried to keep it that way," Doris replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. He turned to face her, his smile faint. "Order brings comfort, doesn't it? A sense of control in a chaotic world." She nodded, unsure where he was leading. "It does." Richard stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. "But sometimes, no matter how much we tidy up, there are things that can't be swept away." Doris felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you trying to say, Richard?" He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Nothing at all," he said lightly, "just an observation." The rest of the evening passed in uneasy conversation. Richard's questions became more pointed, his comments laced with insinuation that left Doris feeling cornered. By the time the clock struck midnight, she was barely holding herself together. "Well," Richard said, rising from the sofa, "it's been a lovely evening, Mrs. Cooper, but I suppose I should let you get some rest." Doris forced a smile. "Yes, of course. Thank you for keeping me company." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. "Thank you for your hospitality. Good night, Mrs. Cooper." As he turned to leave, Doris felt her legs weaken, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't trust him not for a second. And as the door closed behind him, she knew, with chilling certainty, that the past she'd fought so hard to bury was no longer safe. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Doris sat in the armchair, her hands gripping the armrests as if bracing herself against a sudden gust of wind. Richard's parting words lingered in her mind, echoing in the stillness. His presence had unsettled her. Yes, but it was his departure that had left her truly shaken. There had been something in his tone, in the way his gaze had lingered on her, that made her feel as though he knew far more than he should. She glanced toward the door, half expecting another knock, but the house remained silent. Slowly, she rose and went to the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer out into the snowy night. The driveway was empty. If Richard had left on foot, his tracks were already buried under fresh snow. "It's over," she murmured to herself, though the words felt hollow. She closed the curtains and turned back to the living room, her eyes falling on the photograph of Gerald on the mantel. The sight of his smiling face brought a lump to her throat. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the frame. "I've kept it all together," she whispered. "I've done everything right." But even as she said it, a part of her knew it wasn't true. The cracks were showing. The neat and orderly life she'd built since Gerald's death was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. Doris didn't sleep that night. Instead, she moved through the house like a ghost, checking the locks on the doors and windows, pausing now and then to listen for any sound that might indicate Richard's return. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she was exhausted, her nerves stretched taut. The morning brought no relief. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside calm and still. Doris made herself a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the pristine expanse of snow in her backyard. The untouched surface seemed to mock her, its purity a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifted back to the lake. She hadn't been there since that day, the day Gerald had drowned. The official report had called it an accidenta, tragic mishap during an afternoon swim. But Doris knew better. She'd been there. She'd seen the look in his eyes as her grip on the coffee mug tightened, the memory slicing through her like a blade. She told herself it was necessary. Gerald had changed in those final years. He'd become controlling, cruel, a shadow of the man she'd once loved. That day at the lake, when he'd slipped beneath the surface, she'd made a choice, and she'd kept that choice buried ever since. Until now. The knock came that afternoon, startling her from her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding as she stared at the front door. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, pretending she wasn't home. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. With trembling hands, Doris opened the door. Richard stood on the porch, his coat dusted with snow, his expression calm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cooper," he said, his tone as polite as ever. "I hope I'm not intruding." Her mouth went dry. "Richard, what are you doing here?" He smiled faintly. "I realized I left something behind. May I come in?" Doris hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to say no, but then she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He wiped his boots on the mat before stepping into the living room, his eyes scanning the space as if taking inventory. "You have a lovely home," he said, his gaze settling on her. "So warm and inviting." "What did you leave behind?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Oh, nothing physical," he said, turning toward the fire. "Just a conversation we weren't quite finished with." Her breath hitched. "I don't know what you mean." He looked at her, his expression inscrutable. "Don't you?" Doris backed away, her hands clutching the edge of the chair behind her. "I think you should leave." Richard took a step closer, his voice low and measured. "Do you know what the most interesting thing about secrets is, Mrs. Cooper? They have a way of surfacing no matter how deeply they're buried." Her heart pounded, her vision narrowing as the walls seemed to close in around her. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" he repeated, his gaze piercing. "The lake, Gerald, the story you've told yourself over and over. Does it still hold up under scrutiny?" "Get out," she said, her voice rising. "I want you to leave now." Richard held up his hands, a faint smile playing at his lips. "As you wish, Mrs. Cooper, but remember, secrets don't stay buried forever." He turned and walked to the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. Then he was gone, leaving Doris alone in the echoing silence of her perfect, pristine home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house was cloaked in shadow when the knock came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, echoing through the stillness, like the toll of a bell. Doris froze mid-step in the hallway, her breath caught in her chest. She stared at the door as if willing it to remain shut, but the knock came again, harder, more deliberate. She reached for the poker by the fireplace before approaching the door, her hand trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the cold iron. With a deep breath, she cracked the door open. Richard stood there, his coat open to reveal a neatly pressed shirt beneath, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. Snowflakes clung to his dark hair. "Good evening, Mrs. Cooper," he said with a faint smile, his tone maddeningly polite. "May I come in?" "No," Doris said firmly, gripping the door with one hand and the poker with the other. "What do you want, Richard?" He tilted his head, studying her with an expression that bordered on amusement. "We've unfinished business, don't we? It's not good to leave things unresolved." "I've told you to leave," she said, her voice wavering despite her best efforts to sound resolute. "You have no business here." "Oh, but I think I do," he said, stepping forward. She tried to push the door shut, but Richard placed a hand against it, his strength evident as he kept it ajar. "Let's not make this difficult." "Go away," she hissed, raising the poker slightly as a warning. Richard's gaze flicked to the weapon and back to her face, his expression darkening. "Do you really think that's necessary, Mrs. Cooper?" "I'm just here to talk." "Talk about what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What more could you possibly have to say?" He pushed the door open with ease, stepping into the house as Doris stumbled back. He shut the door behind him with a quiet click and turned to face her. "It's not about what I have to say," he said calmly. "It's about what you have to confess." Doris felt the walls closing in around her, the air thick with unspoken accusations. She tightened her grip on the poker, holding it between them like a talisman. "You don't know anything," she said, her voice trembling. "You're just a stranger who doesn't belong here." Richard smiled faintly. "A stranger," he repeated. "Is that how you see me? Because I think we're far more connected than you'd like to admit." She shook her head, taking a step back. "You're lying, am I?" Richard said, his voice softening, almost kind. "Tell me, Doris, when you think about that day at the lake, what do you remember most? The sound of the water, the coldness of the air, or the look on Gerald's face when he realized what you'd done?" Her heart stopped. The poker slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor with a metallic ring. She stared at Richard, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "Oh, but I do," he said, taking a step closer. "I know how a person can be pushed to the edge, how they can convince themselves that they had no choice, that it was necessary." Doris backed away until her knees hit the armchair. She sank into it, her body folding under the weight of his words. "It was an accident," she said weakly. "He slipped. He couldn't swim." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Richard asked, his tone devoid of judgment. "That it was an accident? Or do you replay the moment in your mind, wondering if there was a part of you that wanted him to slip?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she shook her head. "Stop it," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, just stop." Richard crouched down in front of her, his face level with hers. "I'm not here to hurt you, Doris," he said gently. "I just want the truth. Isn't it time you let it out? Isn't it exhausting, carrying it all alone?" The room spun around her, her vision blurring as the memories she'd buried for so long came rushing back. The argument by the water, Gerald's rage, his accusations, the shove, the splash, the silence that followed. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It just happened." Richard nodded slowly, as though her words confirmed something he'd always known. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Doris. That's all I needed to hear." She looked up at him, confusion flickering in her tear-streaked eyes. Why are you doing this?" He stood, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I have my reasons." He stepped back, heading toward the door. "Good night, Mrs. Cooper. Sleep well." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Doris sat in the armchair, her body trembling, the weight of her confession settling over her like a shroud. For the first time in years, the house felt suffocatingly silent. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright, the sunlight glinting off the snow-covered rooftops of Oakwood. Inside her quiet home, Doris sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The embers glowed softly, casting a gentle light across the room. The house felt different. The air seemed lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from its walls. Doris's confession to Richard lingered in her mind, but the knot of tension that had gripped her for years was gone. For the first time since Gerald's death, her thoughts didn't feel like a maze of guilt and fear. She glanced at the door, half expecting another knock. The memory of Richard's calm gaze and the quiet understanding in his voice flickered in her thoughts. He had come and gone like the storm, leaving no trace behind. She had been waiting for him to return, to press her further, but the hours stretched into Christmas Day, and no one came. By evening, Doris found herself gazing at the lake through the framed photo on the mantel. Gerald's smile no longer felt like an accusation. She placed her hand on the frame and murmured, "I'm sorry, Gerald, for everything." Her voice was steady, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She sat back down by the fire, staring into its comforting glow. The weight of her secret had been unbearable, but now that it was shared, even with the stranger, it had lost its power. For the first time, she felt as though the house was truly hers, not a shrine to the past. No more knocks came to her door that night, nor the next. The stillness, once oppressive, now felt like peace. Doris pulled the blanket over her lap and smiled faintly. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world. Thank you for listening.